Welcome to part 5 and the final tutorial in our series on working with Sample 1 XT. And in this tutorial, we are going to take a look at the pitch, filter, amp, LFO, and master section here. So let's go ahead and get started with the pitch section. And to begin with, we have transpose, and here we can transpose our sample plus or minus 48 semitones or 4 octaves just by dragging the slider left or right. And this is pretty self-explanatory. If I play middle C, we can hear our sample playing back in its original pitch. And if I move this down 28 semitones and play again, it's been pitched down. And if you notice, the playback does slow down as well. So if I move to the right, then we pitch up. And again, our playback will change. In this instance, it's going to play back faster. And before we move on, just note that we do have this follow song tempo here. So if I engage that and then play middle C again, we do have the pitch still raised up as we set here, but it plays back at its regular speed. So the follow song tempo is going to allow you to pitch up or down, but have the sample play back at its original speed. And I'll press Control and click to take that back to the default. And then next in line we have tune, and here we can tune our sample in cents, and we have a range of plus or minus 100 cents or 1 semitone. I'll Control click to take that back. Now next in line we have attack, decay, sustain, and release. We have an envelope here, and this ties directly in with the envelope knob here. So the best way to understand this is this envelope knob is essentially a transpose knob. We can pitch up or we can pitch down. The difference between the envelope knob and the transpose in this situation is that this is tied directly in with the attack, decay, sustain, and release. So for instance, if we would like to pitch this sample down over time, then we would move this to the left. And since we have an immediate attack, that change in pitch or lowering of the pitch is going to have an immediate effect. So as soon as I press middle C up, I have to turn follow song tempo off. Okay, so immediately we have this pitch down in effect. Now we can control when it's introduced with the attack. So if I raise this up to, say, about 3 seconds, it should take about 3 seconds before we pitch down to what we have set here. Okay, so we can see how that works. And now next we have decay, and we're going to come back to that in just a second. We then have sustain, and sustain is actually going to act kind of like a slider to move to or from the altered signal and the original. Okay, so when we have the sustain all the way up, it says 0 dB there in the pop-up window, but it's kind of it's a little bit confusing. What we're really doing is saying we want 100% of this pitch change that we've made. If we move it all the way down to the bottom, then this is going to be our original pitch that we have set here. So right now, and the decay, which is why we skipped over this for a second, the decay really only works if you have this set to the bottom, which is going to be this transpose setting here. And in this instance, the decay, we set the time of how long it takes to return to the original pitch when we have this all the way down. It's a little confusing. I feel like I'm not explaining that well, but we saw that the attack is set for 3 seconds to get to our pitch down. Now, after that 3 seconds and we reach this pitch, the decay is set to, let's also set that to about 3 seconds. It should take 3 seconds to return to the pitch that we have here. Okay. There's our 3-second attack to the lowered pitch. Now we have the 3-second decay back to the original pitch that's set here. Now, if I were to raise this up, then this means we're only using the modified signal, which has been pitched down. And the decay time, this is kind of moot. This control is kind of moot now. It doesn't really do anything, at least not that I've heard. So we'll hear our 3-second attack to the pitch down. Okay, and so even if I were to raise the decay up to 20 seconds, we're still only utilizing that 3-second attack. So just keep in mind that the decay is only going to work when you have the sustain set to the bottom, and that means it's going to return back to the original pitch here. Okay. Now I'm going to control click on the envelope, and let's move on to the LFO, and we can use this knob to control how much of the LFO or low frequency oscillator, this modulation, we're going to allow to affect our pitch. And just moving to the right or left is basically control for polarity. So let's introduce a bit of the LFO here and hear how that sounds. And the further we go, the more of the LFO we introduce. Okay, and so we're set right now on a sine, and our rate is about 4 hertz. So we can adjust the rate here. We can change our LFO shape through this pop-up menu. So if I change this to saw, raise the rate up, okay, let's listen to one more, the square. This is basically going to be kind of an on-off. Okay, and while we're here, we'll just go ahead and cover the rest of these controls. With delay, we can introduce a delay in seconds before the LFO actually kicks in. So if I raise this up to, let's say, about 1.5 seconds, let's change the waveform back to a saw. So you can hear there's that 1.5 second delay that we introduced before our effect, the LFO, actually kicks in. Now next we have sync, and if we activate that, then it's going to sync the LFO to our song tempo that we have set within the transport, and then we can choose different timing subdivisions here. And we still have our delay knob here, but this is going to work in time subdivisions such as half a bar or 1 bar. So in this instance, it would take 1 bar before the LFO kicks in. Okay, and so when we disengage the sync, then we return back to adjusting our rate in hertz, and our delay goes back to working in seconds. And if we actually turn off the free, then the LFO is going to sync to note on. But we have our so whenever you press a key, the LFO is going to start over again with that key press of the key. Okay, and lastly, in the LFO section, we have mod, and this is going to allow us to determine how our mod will affect or activate our LFO. I'll control click to take that back to the default position. And let's come back to our pitch, and I'll control click to take that back as well. And let's move on to the filter. And just note that with each of these sections, we do have this LED at the top that we can click on to activate and deactivate. So the first thing that we'll take a look at is the cutoff here, and this is going to allow us to cut frequencies from our audio sample, and by default this is going to be on a low pass filter, and we're all the way up at the top at 20 kilohertz, so we're allowing all of our sample to come through. And as I move this to the left, we then cut out the high frequencies. We can change the type of filter that we're using by clicking on this triangle here, and then we can access different low pass filters, high pass, band pass, as well as an eco filter here that's going to go a little easy on our processor. So then if I were to change this to a high pass, our signal will be lost because this now switches and we're cutting all the way up to 20 kilohertz. So we would need to then lower this to introduce the lower frequencies, because we're now working in that high pass mode. But let's come back to the low pass. And next we have resonance, and this is basically going to boost the audio around the area that we're cutting. So if I were to lower this to, let's see, about, we've got 990 hertz. If I go ahead and increase the resonance, we can hear it's boosted around that area. And if I sweep through this, it will make even more sense. And that is the resonance. And we then have attack, decay, sustain, and release, as we saw within the pitch section. And just as with the pitch section, this ties directly in with the envelope here. And in this instance, we saw that the envelope was basically a transpose button that was married to these controls. Well, this is the same. This envelope knob is a cutoff knob, and it's married to these controls. So if we would like to cut frequencies, I'm going to raise this initial cutoff back up to 20 kilohertz, because this works in tandem with the first cutoff here. So if we were to take this down to this 1 kilohertz, and then we were to lower the cutoff here as well, we're going to be taking off of this 1 kilohertz, not the full frequencies. So again, I'm going to pull that all the way back up, and let's lower this. And we have an immediate attack, so that cut will be immediate. Okay, so far it functions exactly the same as this. But again, as we saw in the pitch section, if I raise this up to about 3 seconds, it's going to take 3 seconds for that cut to be introduced. Let's make that even more drastic. Okay. And the sustain is basically going to function the same as the sustain that we saw in the pitch section. So all the way at the top, we're going to hear 100% of our cut that we've made here. All the way at the bottom, we are going to hear what we have set here. Okay, so cuts that I make here, we can definitely hear that. Now, if I raise this all the way up to the top, then we're only going to hear the setting that we have on the envelope knob. Well, let me take the attack down first. Okay, so we can hear our cut. Now, if I lower this down, we hear the first cutoff here. So this is, again, just a slider that we can choose to blend the two signals together from our initial cutoff that we have set there and the one that we have set on the envelope. And the decay is going to work directly in, or only really with this position set at the bottom, and is going to determine how long it takes before we return to the cutoff set here. So right now, if I take the decay up to 3 seconds, it's going to take 3 seconds to return from our cut here, which has an immediate attack, to our original setting. Okay, so I'm going to take the sustain up, so that we'll only be working with this here, and the decay, we'll just leave that there. We then have release, and I actually didn't cover the release when we were in the pitch section. The release is going to determine how long it takes before we return to our original cutoff setting after we release the key, after we're no longer pressing the key. And in order for the release to work in the filter section or the pitch section, we need to be sure that we turn the release up on the amp section to actually have an audio signal to apply it to. So now we have an immediate attack of our cut. We're going to hear 100% of that cut because our sustain is all the way up. And then if I take the release up to about 2 seconds, when I release the key, it's going to take 2 seconds to return to this setting here. And I'm going to click on the keyboard button to open that up so you can see when I'm actually releasing the key. I'll press middle C, we can see here, and then I'm going to release. And we can hear our setting here returns after about 3 seconds. And I'm going to make that a little bit shorter. Or actually, I'll leave that at about 3 seconds and increase our release time on the amp section. I'll press and then release. And we can hear our frequencies gradually reintroduce that we have set on the cutoff here. I'll control click to take that back and set the release back to as it was. Now next we have velocity, and this knob is going to control how the filter affects our keys based on what pitch that we're playing. So if I move this to the left, then we are going to cut frequencies the harder we press the keys on our keyboard. So if I press this softly, and I'm going to take the release down on our amp section, and if I press hard, the frequencies are pretty much all gone. I'll raise that up a little bit. Softly, we can hear our sample, and then the harder I press, the duller it gets. Okay, and so moving to the right is just basically going to work in the opposite way. And for that, if we were to use the high pass filter, and then let's let all of the frequencies through. Let's take that back to the default. So we have our high pass, and we cut the lower frequencies as we move to the right. So now if I move this to the right, then the harder I press, the more of the lower frequencies we're going to cut. Softly, we can hear our original sample. Now as I press hard, those lower frequencies are cut out. Softly, and then now we're pretty much cutting everything when we have it raised up this high, when you are pressing the key pretty hard. Okay, then next we have LFO, and we've already taken a look at that on the pitch section, but this is just going to modulate the filter cutoff when we activate it within this section. And then we have our mod, which was a knob that we can use to control how our mod wheel will affect the frequencies. So let's come back to the low pass and allow all of the frequencies, taking that up to 20 kilohertz. And I'm going to control click to set the velocity back. And then with the mod, let's say we would like to cut frequencies. So I'll go ahead and play the middle C. And then as I move the mod wheel, you can look down at the virtual keyboard. We are cutting those frequencies out. So just pay attention to this here as I raise that up. We can see that those frequencies are cut out. And there's a little bit of distortion there because our LFO is still on. I'll control click to take that back. And let's do this one last time. I'll raise the mod wheel and we cut those frequencies. And moving to the right is just basically going to function the same as what we saw just a second ago. So if we were to switch this to the high pass and then cut this a little bit, then we can just use this in the opposite way. I'll set that back to default. And then we have drive. And drive basically controls the overdrive of the filter and can add fullness to your sound. So if I play back. Okay, and then we have punch, which is going to add a percussive attack to your sample. We can hear that as it is with it off. If I move all the way to the right, we can hear that's, as the name says, it's a bit more punchy. And then next we have key. And key, basically, it's going to be set to 0 by default. But if we were to raise this up, then basically, as we play higher notes, we're going to get higher frequencies. And then as we move down the keyboard and play those lower notes, the frequencies are going to be more gradually cut from our sample. And this is basically emulating a live instrument. So for instance, if you're playing a guitar, the higher notes are going to have more harmonics and have a crisper sound than the lower notes are going to be a bit dull. So as we move this to the right, we introduce that sort of behavior to our sample. The higher notes are going to have more harmonics and a crisper sound. Then as we play the key down, it's going to start cutting the higher frequencies out and introduce a more softer, dull sound. I'll take that back to as it was. And finally, in the filter section, we have soft. And there are two analog model circuits that you can choose from, and this button allows you to choose between those. So when this is engaged, it will give you a darker tone, and when it's disengaged, you will have a brighter sound. Okay, so next we have the amp section, and this is going to control the level of our signal. We have our gain control. By default, this is going to be set to 0 dB, but we can take that all the way down to minus 144 or up to plus 20. I'll control click again. We then have pan control for our sample. And then we have our attack, decay, sustain, and release, and we saw how these function, but just in this way, it's going to adjust the amplitude or audio level of our sound. So right now we have an immediate attack, but if I were to raise this up to our regular 3 seconds here that I keep using, this is going to take about 3 seconds until we reach that full level. And then we have our decay and sustain. Sustain is going to control the level of our sample for as long as we're holding the key. So the sustain in all of these instances ties directly with, is linked directly with when we are actively holding the key down on our controller and what's going to happen to our sample while we're doing that. So if I were to lower this to, say, about minus 9 dB, we should have that 3-second introduction to full volume, and then our decay is, let's set that to about 3.5 seconds. So I'll play back 3 seconds to our full volume, then we should have another 3 seconds. We should fade out. Let me make that attack shorter. Okay, about 1 second to full volume. Now we should have 3.5 seconds to our sustain. We can hear that getting quieter. I'll lower that just a little bit more. Okay, now as soon as I release the key, the signal is stopped, our sample stops playing, and that's because our release is all the way down. If we would like to have the audio continue on for a bit after we've released the key, we would just raise this up, let's say 2.3 seconds. So now I'm going to take the sustain up and get rid of that attack. Now I'll release the key. And we have that gradual reduction in our signal. I'll take the release all the way back down. And now we have LFO, and here we can introduce modulation from our LFO. Let's change this to a sine. Okay, so this is just as we've seen with the other sections. We then have velocity here, and all the way to the right, we will have full range in our dynamics here. So if I play soft, we have a soft playback of our sample. If I play hard, we have full volume. If we move all the way to the right, then no matter how hard or soft I play, the sample is going to play back at the same volume. So everywhere in between, we can just adjust how much we would like our sample to be affected by velocity. Okay, and finally in the amp section we have mod, and this is going to allow us to turn our mod wheel into a level control. So if I move this to the right and play the sample back, just take note of the mod wheel, because as I increase it, it's going to increase the level of our signal. And alternatively, if we were to move to the left, I'll play back, and then as I raise the mod wheel, if you take note on the virtual keyboard, the volume will be reduced. Okay. Now we have seen the LFO section already, so that just leaves the master section. And here we have a master volume out, keeping in mind we could have a lot of different samples that are loaded in here. So the amp section is going to be level control for each individual sample. The master is master level control for all of the samples that we may have loaded within Sample 1 XT. Now, next in line, we can change this to be mono so that only one voice will play back at a time. With that disengaged, I can play one, another, and keep going and add as many voices as I'd like, up to 32, because that's currently the voice limit that's set here. We can actually increase that all the way up to 64 is the maximum. I'll control click to set that back. And this display to the left is going to show how many voices are currently being played. So if I hold a key, we can see one. As I press a second key, we see two, and so on. So coming back up to the top here, when I engage mono, we can only play one key at a time. The previous notes are going to be dropped. And when we have mono engaged, we also have glide available. So if I go ahead and select that, with this, we can introduce a glide in between the notes that we're playing. So if I press and hold a key, and then while holding, press another, we can hear we have a bit of a glide. And we can increase that with this dial here. So I'll raise that all the way up, press and hold. While holding, I'll press another key and release the... Okay, so that is the glide, and that's how that works. Okay, so we've pretty much covered everything here. The last thing I'll mention is down at the bottom, we do have a field here where we can input in semitones how much the bend wheel is going to change, pitch up or down our sample. So by default, it's going to be set to three semitones. If I play back and raise that, just take note of the bend wheel. Now, if I change this to 12 for one whole octave and play back again, lower it. Okay, and so I think we will go ahead and wrap up here. If you are interested in the effects, then I will leave a link right about here that should be popping up. I covered all of the different effects. These are basically taken from my Thai. So if you check out that link, then you can see the tutorial that I created covering the different parameters for all of the various effects that are included here.